Europe Under Napoleon by Michael Broers. Michael Broers' 1996 book Napoleon Under Europe examines the French Empire as a European phenomenon. Broers reports on Napoleon's empire, its policies, and its disparate regions rather than simply offering a military campaign history. In the book's introduction, Broers laments the lack of historiography that offers Napoleon from this perspective. He states, quote, Napoleon is a European figure, as much as, or even more than a part of French history, but it is only recently that attempts have been made to consider him a European as opposed to a national context. Broers is a widely acclaimed Napoleonic scholar and is currently professor of history at Oxford University. His other books include The Napoleonic Empire in Italy, 1796 to 1814, Napoleon's Other Wars, Bandits, Rebels, and Their Pursuits in the Age of Revolutions, and Napoleon, Soldier of Destiny. The first chapters examine the French conquest and consolidation of the empire in Europe. Broers briefly offers an overview of the French military under Napoleon at this time. He notes the importance of the corps system, stating, its tactical use in war was its ability to fight large enemy forces unsupported, at least until reinforcements arrived. He then quickly details the crucial campaigns and battles of the time, such as Ulm and Austerlitz and Jena and Auerstadt. A military ethos permeated the empire, as military victory formed a crucial pillar of the Napoleonic system. However, the empire was more than merely a military dictatorship. Broers asserts that Napoleon actively played the role of head of state. For instance, he personally oversaw the majority of government committee sessions that created the Civil Code. He also increasingly centralized political power, albeit on top of often competing agencies and interests. Broers relates that, quote, the Napoleonic system was centralized in the manner of a spider's web. Napoleon also consolidated power by creating new constitutions for many imperial satellite states that were closely modeled on France's, and ordered a detailed imperial land survey to fully catalog property ownership. Broers maintains that, quote, no other single issue is as central to Napoleonic Europe as conscription. Despite Napoleon's increasingly desperate need for manpower, the process of conscription brought with it a host of problems that had ramifications in virtually every corner of the empire. It was a policy that engendered resentment everywhere it took place. Local leaders often refused to help draw up the necessary lists for conscription. While the empire prided itself on its modern forms of civil administration, the practices of implementing conscription often required the use of force and the threat of force. This fact often undermined the efforts of administrators. The Kingdom of Westphalia, a Napoleonic creation, proved the most reliable region in the empire for providing troops. Other states, such as Bavaria, Baden, and Württemberg, required increased enforcement, greater bureaucratization, and the revocation of traditional privileges to meet imperial quotas. Further consolidation of the empire required the creation of new regional elites. However, Napoleon, obsessed with centralization, could not give these local elites political power. Their emperor, therefore, rewarded this new class with titles and bribes in order to secure their personal loyalty to him. Frequently, these bribes, or donations, took the form of lands confiscated from royals or the church. The lands brought revenue and prestige and remained in the recipient's family. Broers explains that, quote, the donations did not carry any political or judicial rights, neither equality before the law nor the state's monopoly of power were compromised in any way. The empire depended upon these prefects and administrators to function properly. Because of this, Broers refers to it as, quote, the empire of professionals. Broers also presents the realities of collaboration with the empire and resistance to it. Religion often played a key role in these considerations. While Napoleon sought to emancipate the Jews throughout his empire, this was often met with defiance and contention. He comments, quote, French officials dreaded Easter all over the empire, as a time when feelings ran high, and an essentially hostile church reasserted its hold over the people. In Pisa, the French had banned church sermons that blamed the Jews for Christ's death. The resulting disturbances necessitated the use of troops to restore order. Napoleon had to bow to local pressures to delay Jewish emancipation or to limit it in order to maintain harmony in various regions in Central Europe. The Mennonite emancipation in Krefeld provided the empire with willing collaborators that were grateful to at last have the opportunity to serve in public life. Other factors could determine loyalty or resistance to the empire as well. According to Broers, the unusual for the time Polish nationalism made that region's elites firm friends to the empire. Additionally, military victories, such as those at Jena and Auerstadt, could turn, quote, passive resistance into reluctant collaboration. In many cases, after the tumult of military action, France's restoration of order proved an important inducement to support the empire. Throughout Napoleon's domain, both time and the empire's apparent perception of that meant locals were willing to give up the idea of resistance and serve the French. Broers asserts, quote, clear-sighted self-interest had replaced dewy-eyed idealism. Broers rejects the idea that nationalism played a major role in opposition to Napoleon's empire. Indeed, as mentioned above, Poland was virtually the only place in Europe that saw a truly national movement. There, the Poles did not fight against the French, but saw in the empire the chance to restore their nation. Breurs maintains that, quote, Polish enthusiasm for the French cause stemmed from a truly nationalist patriotism, almost unique in Europe at the time. The forces of nationalism unleashed by the French Revolution did not spread like wildfire, only to turn back against the French Empire. Uprisings against the French were sparked by opposition to imperial policy rather than from incipient nationalist fervor. Breurs also explores similar issues within France. Fears of a resurgence of the Parisian mob still existed during the empire. Frochot, a Paris prefect, hoped to turn the city into an imperial capital made up of professionals, with little room for the brooding masses ripe for political agitation. However, lack of money for Frochot's project and Paris's growing industrial character ensured that the working class remained in the city. Quote, the goodwill of Paris rested on a combination of prosperity and good order, and Napoleonic policy centered on providing them. Breurs further argues that the Maginot Line, a line running from just south of Normandy southeast toward the Swiss border, proved an important division in French politics and economics during the empire. The regions south and west of the line tended towards subtle resistance and open rebellion, while those north and east of the line were very easily managed by the empire. Breurs considers the British blockade's economic and political repercussions throughout the empire. Initially, Napoleon had hoped that the constituent parts of the empire would work with him to maintain the blockade. However, before long, the emperor realized that force must be employed to ensure compliance. Breurs offers the scene in Livorno, Tuscany, as French forces destroyed smuggled English merchandise. Quote, dumbfounded crowds saw confiscated goods piled high on the main square and ceremoniously set alight. Soon it was very clear that the French would stay until they had broken blockade running. Similar occurrences took place in the Netherlands and in the Hansa. Breurs explains that the British blockade necessitated the organization of the Outer Empire, the Hansa, the Netherlands, and northern Italy. French hegemony over Europe followed from that organization. Breurs notes that the Napoleonic experience in Spain was nothing short of a disaster. It did, however, serve to harden troops for the latter battles against Central European foes. Napoleon's brother Joseph is presented as incompetent, unable to manage the increasingly untenable military situation. Both the British and French, he observes, believed their own sense of cultural superiority over the Spanish. In 1813, as the Anglo-Portuguese force moved through Spain, it frequently committed atrocities against civilians in the same manner that the French army had done earlier. Breurs comments, quote, the sack of San Sebastian, its rape would be more appropriate, rivaled the deeds of the French armies at their worst. Both the British and the French saw themselves as exclusively the defenders of civilization. Such attitudes justified their antipathy toward other nations and their willingness to resort to barbarity in Spain. Breurs argues that the empire at the time existed in three parts. The inner empire, or core, consisted of an enlarged France, northern Italy, the Netherlands, the Hansa, and various other West German states. The outer empire encompassed the states of Central and Eastern Europe. Beyond both lay parts of Europe that Napoleon never conquered. Breurs affirms that, quote, in the outer empire, Napoleonic rule was traumatic and destabilizing. The empire had ultimately retarded the growth of social, political, and economic development in these regions in favor of French power. The inner empire, however, benefited from Napoleonic institutions. An administrative and legal heritage marked these territories and formed the basis for the modern state. Europe Under Napoleon is a work of synthesis based upon a broad bibliography. Breurs notes that the sources he uses are far from complete, and that he did not draw on, quote, the rich literature of the British Isles, Russia, Scandinavia, or the Balkans for the Napoleonic period. The bibliography is organized largely along geographic lines, beginning with general works on Napoleon and the Empire, Italy, Germany, Spain, and elsewhere. Some of the more notable works include Owen Connolly's Napoleon Satellite Kingdoms, Geoffrey Ellis's The Napoleonic Empire, and Stuart Wolff's Napoleon's Integration of Europe. Europe Under Napoleon is a fascinating examination of Napoleon's empire and the various forces at work within it. Breurs expertly presents its mechanisms, institutions, and attitudes that shaped the empire's course during its turbulent existence. Even as Napoleon struggled to consolidate his military gains, the political realities of ruling the empire often proved beyond the abilities of French administrators. Still, Breurs highlights the remarkable achievements and profound power that the empire exerted. He does so in an easy-to-read style that both new students and professional academics will appreciate. Europe Under Napoleon is a fine contribution to Napoleonic literature.